Good morning, 5th grade. We are going to go ahead and move on to the next section of Chapter 9. The title of this section is called Shape of Distribution. And what we're going to be looking at today is when we set up data in maybe a histogram or a bar graph or a dot plot or a box and whisker plot, we take a look at the actual shape. Whoops, sorry, Hugh. We take a look at the actual shape that the graph is, and we can notice some different characteristics about the graph and how the data is set up in it. So there are some cutouts that go along with this. So if you did not print those out yet, please pause the video, print those out, and please also put the date off in the corner. Today is the 13th. Now make sure if you're putting your heading on the bottom of an old page, make sure you have enough space to paste this in. If not, just hop on over to another page. Okay, so your first cutout should be a chart that looks like this. And we're going to take a look at a couple different features that we might notice as we are looking at a few examples today. So let's start with the first one here. Here's a sample of what this might look like. You'll notice that these lie very close together. They're all kind of smushed together. This is what we call a cluster. Okay, a cluster has data points that are all very tight together, kind of all compressed into one small spot. This here is a line graph. Now this is one that we did not work with in Chapter 9, but hang on, let me adjust this. What's wrong with it? That's a little bit clearer. There we go. We did not work with this in Chapter 9, but taking a look at this, we can see that it has this high point. Okay, that high point there, we call this a peak, like the peak of a mountain. It is higher than any of the other points in the graph, or in the if we're dealing with the dot plot, it would be the highest point in the dot plot, the highest point in the histogram, whatever type we're looking at there. Okay, the next one here, you can see in this dot plot, we have several values at 6, several values at 7. We don't have any at 8 or 9, and then it starts up again at 10. So where there is no data between like a set of it, we call this a gap. Makes sense. It looks like there is literally a gap right there on the number line. So, it looks like a gap, we call it a gap. Alright, and this last one here, it is the same on either side of the center. If I were to take a mirror and put it right down the middle here, it would look the same on this side as it does on that side. And we have a special word for that. That's called symmetry. When it looks the same, exactly, or pretty close to the same. It might be off by 1 point or so, but as long as it's pretty close to identical on either side, we call that symmetry. So these are the 4 kinds that we're going to be dealing with: cluster, peak, gap, and symmetry. So what we're going to do now, and this is where your next set of cutouts is going to come in. You'll notice some of them are highlighted a particular color. If they're both highlighted the same color, that means those go together. And I think this is the only example of the 2 that are highlighted. So I'm going to hop up here. Going to put a number 1. And I'm going to go ahead and glue both of these in. I'll put an A. I'm going to paste this right next to it, and this is going to go, I'll put this over to the side, that will go beneath, and leave yourself some space on the side of your cutout here so that you can write. So pause and glue in, I'll do the same. Okay, so let's take a look at what we have here. We are going to go ahead and describe these as having gaps, peaks, or symmetry. So let's start with the first one. Let's start with A. I'm just going to put a little A with a dot next to it here so I know which one I'm talking about. Now, if you had to take a look at that and describe that as having gaps, peaks, or symmetry, which would you pick? I would say, now it does look like these two here are kind of high, so you might think peak, but there's 1, 2, 3, there's 4 of them. So I would say peak, probably not, and gaps, no, there's nothing, not filled in, so definitely symmetry, because if I were to draw a dotted line right down here, it's the exact same on either side. So A definitely has symmetry going on. All right, let's take a look at B. This is a box and whisker plot, so it might be a little bit hard to tell, but I want you to take a look at the very center here. Okay, remember what each of these are called. We have our lower quartile, our median, and our upper quartile. They're all really close together, right? I would say, oh, this one isn't listed there. They forgot to write this one. Or cluster. I would say this one is a cluster. Because look how close together these guys are. Yeah, they are very, very close. I would say I don't see a gap there. That would be hard to see on a box and whisker plot. It might also be hard to see a peak. Symmetry might be easier to see on a box and whisker plot, but gap and peak would be difficult to see. But I would say definitely for this one, a cluster would be a good pick. It doesn't look symmetrical. Maybe if this whisker was a little shorter, or if that whisker was a little longer, I would be able to write symmetry. But I would say just cluster for that one. Let's take a look at C. This is a bar graph. This is not a histogram. Remember, histograms, the bars have to touch each other. So this is just a bar graph. So if we had to pick gap, peak, symmetry, or cluster, well, you can see there's a big gap right here. So I would definitely say gap for this one. I wouldn't say peak, but I would say symmetry. Even though there's nothing in the middle, if I were to kind of cut this right down the center, I have gaps in the same spot. These two are the same height, and these two are the same height. So I would definitely say gap and symmetry. I hope I'm spelling symmetry right. I think I am. I am spelling right. Good. But I wouldn't say cluster, because it might be hard to tell cluster on a bar graph, since they're not technically touching anyway. So that one might be hard to determine. But yeah, I think gap and symmetry for that one would definitely work. Let's try this a different way. I'm going to hop down here. I'm going to put a B. And this is our next one. So I'm going to pause and glue in. Please do the same. Okay, so mine is glued in. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we've got two different distributions of data here. I'm just going to call this number 1, and we'll call that number 2. And we've got 3 descriptions here, and we're going to match each one. Oh, I have an email. We're going to match each one to the correct distribution. So pause for a moment, take a look at each of these, and then I want you to write the letter X, Y, or Z next to 1 and 2 and tell me which one best describes 1 and which one best describes 2. Now, each one is only going to get 1 letter. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to write down the letter I think it is. I want you to do the same. And then when you're ready, hit play, and we'll see if our answers match each other. All right. So here are the letters I picked, and I will say why I chose each one of these. So for number 1, I said it had to be Y, where there was a cluster and a gap. Because if you take a look here, these 3 are all kind of close together, and then there's this gap here until we get to that guy. So that's why I picked Y for number 1, because it did seem to me to be a cluster here and then a gap until the last point. Now for the last one, number 2, I picked Z because from what I'm seeing, yeah, it's low here, but that's not a gap. If there's a data point there, no gap. And it does look like, even though this one's lower, they're both still pretty high. So I chose that as the 2 peaks. So that's what I picked for those. No gap and 2 peaks. So that was my choice. Now, if you had chosen X for number 2, I could see how you would reason that. Because even though there's a point here, it does seem that there are very few data points in there, and you still have the 2 peaks. So if you had picked X, I could see your reasoning for that one. But number 1 definitely should be Y. Okay, so believe it or not, that's actually all I have for this lesson today. So I'm going to have you guys pause. I don't think there's an IXL lesson that goes along with this, but I will double check. But that's the end of the video for now.